Back in 2015, my wife and I, along with our friends Jake and Tabby, had been planning this hike trip for many weeks. We all worked together, and it was rare for us to get a long weekend off at the same time, given that we all have such drastically different jobs. So when the opportunity finally came, we jumped at it. And the plan was to head out early Saturday morning and spend the entire day exploring the wilderness. We'd mapped out a trail that promised stunning views, and we were all eager to disconnect from the world for a while. The drive to the trailhead was peaceful. The sun was just starting to rise, so the entire drive had this very amazing orange color, and we were laughing, swapping stories, and enjoying the early start. But as soon as we arrived at the trailhead, our excitement took a hit. The sky darkened almost instantly, and within minutes, it started to downpour. It was raining so hard that you couldn't even see anything in front of you. We hoped it was just a passing shower and decided to wait it out in the car. We'd already made the drive there. We weren't about to turn around and drive home already. The rain pounded against the roof, and the windows fogged up with our breath. It wasn't the start that we'd imagined, but we were determined to make the best of it. And after about 20 minutes, the rain let up, leaving behind a very misty and overcast day. We debated whether we should continue the hike, but the trail was calling us, and we didn't want to waste any time. So we grabbed our gear and headed out. We didn't get very far before the rain started again, this time even harder. It was like someone had turned on a faucet and we were drenched within seconds. We ran back to the car, laughing and cursing at the same time, trying to shield ourselves from the downpour. But as we reached the car, we saw something that made us all stop in our tracks. Standing next to the SUV was a young woman. She was soaked to the bone, and her clothes clinging to her thin frame were like rags. She looked like she had been through hell, and her hair was matted and her face was covered with seemingly dirt. And at first I thought maybe I was seeing things because of the rain, but no, she was definitely real and standing directly next to my car. Even more creepy was that she appeared to be looking into the windows. Now, without even thinking, I shouted something out like, "Hey, get away from my car." That was more out of fear than anything else. It was instinctive, and I just felt like I had this rush of adrenaline that was telling me something wasn't quite right. She didn't move though. She stood there, staring at us with these very hollow eyes. She had that look like a deer gives you in the middle of the woods when they're just sort of standing there like statues. Before I could let out another angry scream, my wife held me back and said to me in a very concerned voice to wait and hold on. She even said that she looked kind of hurt. Now Jake and Tabby were silent, unsure of what to do. I didn't want to let the stranger into our car, but I couldn't ignore the fact that she might be in serious trouble, and so against my better judgment, we all piled into the SUV with a woman sitting behind the front passenger seat and my wife in the middle seat in the back trying to comfort this woman. The car was cramped, the windows fogged up again from the sudden influx of bodies, and you could just feel the tension in the car. It went from a fun hiking trip to now dealing with a strange and potentially hurt woman in the middle of nowhere. The woman didn't say much, in fact she didn't say anything at all, and she just sat there, shivering and staring straight ahead. My wife thought that she looked like she was maybe in shock and she started to assume the worst. The woman had makeup running all down her cheeks and was impossible to tell if that was from the rain or crying, and we tried to ask her where she was from and what had happened to her, but she didn't respond. I kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror trying to read her expressions, but there was nothing there, just this sort of vacant look. The lights were on, but clearly nobody was home. Jake suggested that we should get her to the nearest gas station and call for help, and we all agreed. There was no cell service out here, so that was our best option. I started the car and we headed down this muddy road. The windshield wipers were working overtime to keep the rain at bay. Now I know it's easy to say this now, but something just still wasn't sitting right with me. I know this was a tense situation, but that's not what bothered me. The way she just sort of appeared out of nowhere, her silence, with the way she didn't seem to be fazed by the cold or the rain, that's what bothered me. It was clear to me that this woman had issues, and it was impossible to tell if she was dangerous or just truly shaken up about something. I could tell my wife and friends were trying to stay calm, but I could feel the discomfort they all felt, especially Tabby. We were about 2 minutes from the gas station when the woman suddenly started to scream. And not just a little scream, but it was a loud, high-pitched, guttural sound that startled me so badly that I started to lose control of the car. She thrashed around in the back seat, hitting the windows and the seats, making it impossible for me to regain control of the vehicle. I tried my best to at least keep the SUV on the road, but the road was slick, and before I knew it, the car veered off the road and into a ditch. The car now having come to a sudden stop, and for a moment, everything was silent except for the pounding of the rain. We were all trying to catch our breath, trying to make sense of what just happened, but then the woman just starts cackling. It was this cold, empty laugh that was kind of bringing us back to reality. She was howling in laughter. I had a minor scrape on my forehead from hitting my head on the steering wheel, but everyone else appeared to be physically okay, and before anyone else could say anything, Jake just shouted at her, "What the hell is wrong with you?" And this woman's insane laughter came to some abrupt end. She pulled out a small blade from the inside of her shirt. It looked like a box cutter from where I was sitting. She put her left elbow into my wife's neck and then held the blade with her right hand to Tabby's neck. She said, "Give me all your money now." It was one of the most unsettling parts about this nightmare that was unfolding. It was that there was no trace of fear in her voice, only a sick sort of satisfaction. And we didn't argue. We just threw down whatever cash or else we had, as we were all too scared to do anything else. My wife started crying. Jake was cursing under his breath, and I was just trying to keep it together for everyone. The woman grabbed the money, opened the car door, and just started sprinting into the rain without looking back. We sat there in silence with only the backseat door open, and after a few seconds I started the car again, and my wife closed the door and we drove the rest of the way to the gas station. We reported this incident, but by then, obviously, this crazy woman was long gone. The police took our statements, but it was clear that they didn't expect to find her. To this day, I have no idea who that woman was or where she came from. I thought maybe she was a meth addict or something, and I remember for a while after that I was looking up crimes in the area, but I never found anything that even remotely fit that description. All I know is that we were lucky to get out of that situation alive. This was one of the worst experiences of my life, and even though I was happy to get out physically unharmed, I still think about it and it makes me sick knowing that somewhere out there, that wild woman is most likely terrorizing someone else. It was the last week before I had to head back to college, and my friends Jess and Katie decided that we needed one more adventure before the summer officially ended. We planned a light hike through the woods and an overnight camp out, but nothing too intense. No pun intended for those who just got my intense joke. Anyways, we just wanted enough of a getaway to feel like we'd done something for our summer besides working and binge-watching Netflix. And the day started out exactly how we'd hoped. We packed up the car with our gear, grabbed some snacks, and hit the road with music blasting and the windows down. I think we played Wrecking Ball by Miley Cyrus at least 7 times, and the hike we chose was about an hour away and a spot Jesse's older brother had told us about. "It's pretty secluded," he said, "but it's beautiful and you'll practically have the place to yourselves." And that sounded perfect to us. On the way, we decided it wouldn't be a real camping trip without some beers, so we pulled into a gas station to try our luck. Now, none of us were 21 yet, but Katie, with her usual confidence, strode into the store to give it a shot. Jess and I waited in the car, laughing and chatting, but when Katie came back out empty-handed and shaking her head, we knew that it was a no-go. In an annoyed voice, she said, "A stupid guy wouldn't even entertain the idea." And Katie sighed as she slid back into the driver's seat. I could tell that she was slightly embarrassed. Katie wasn't used to hearing no, I guess. And just as we were about to give up on the beer idea, a guy who had been filling up his tank walked over to our car, and he looked normal enough. He was of average height and a little scruffy, maybe in his mid-20s. He was wearing this nice purple flannel that didn't look ragged or gross. Most noticeable, though, was that he had this friendly smile. But something about the way he was so quick to approach us set off a tiny alarm bell in my head. In a deep and almost bellowing voice, he says, "Hey." And then he started leaning down to Jess's window. "Saw you had some trouble in there. Need help getting something?" His tone seemed casual, but his eyes were all over each of us, lingering just a bit too long for comfort. Katie, always the bold one, jumped at the chance. "Yeah. Could you grab us some beers? We got cash." She handed him a 20 and he nodded, smiling. "Sure thing. What do you want?" Still, something about his handsome smile was just off to me. Katie continued talking to him, and I tried silently communicating my unease with Jesse and Katie, but it was just too late now. The guy was already walking into the store. When he came back out, he had a case of beer in one hand and the change in the other. "Here you go," he said, handing it all over with that same smile. But then he hesitated like he was waiting for something. "Thanks, man," Katie said quickly, grabbing the beer and giving him a sort of little wave. And Jess started the car, and before the guy could say anything else, we drove off. As we pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced back and saw that he was just still standing there, seemingly watching us. "That was weird," I muttered, but Katie brushed it off by saying something like, "Relax, he's just being nice. We got our beer, didn't we?" And the drive to the trailhead was uneventful, and soon we were out in the woods, surrounded by tall trees and the sound of birds. The hike was gorgeous, just like Jess's brother had said. The path wound through the trees with sunlight flittering through the leaves, and we were laughing, taking pictures and enjoying the peace that came with being away from civilization. But as the day wore on, I started to feel a little uneasy. Every now and then I thought that I heard something, simple things like a twig snapping, the leaves rustling, or the sound of a sudden shifting in the distance. But whenever I turned around, there was nothing there. I told myself it was just the usual sounds of the forest because honestly, they were. No matter what I told myself, I just couldn't shake a certain feeling. And by the time we set up camp, the sun was finally setting and our little corner of the forest started to get dark very fast. We built a small fire, roasted some marshmallows, and cracked open a few of those beers that we almost didn't end up with. Jess and Katie were having a blast, and on the surface, I appeared to be having a blast as well as I continued trying to ignore the creepy darkness around us. While we were sitting around the campfire, it was Jess who first mentioned the sounds out loud. "Do you guys hear that?" she asked in a low voice, almost a whisper. "It sounds like, I don't know, like someone walking around out there." Katie was quick with a response, saying, "Come on, it's probably just animals." But even she didn't sound entirely convinced. We all sat there, listening intently, but after a while, the noise stopped and we tried to shake off the uncomfortable vibe that was surrounding the fire now. Eventually, we crawled into the tent, snuggled into our sleeping bags, and tried to get some sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. The sounds outside started up again. It was faint, but at least to me, the sounds appeared unmistakable. All those twigs snapping and the leaves rustling sounded a lot like bipedal footsteps, and my heart was pounding, and I could tell by the way Jess and Katie were shifting in their bags that they clearly were awake and hearing it too. After what felt like hours of just lying there, eyes wide open in the dark, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. The fire had died down before we got into the tent, and I wanted to make sure that it was completely out by now. I whispered to the girls that I was stepping outside for a minute, and they seemed to agree silently. I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the cool night. The woods were pitch black, except for a little glow of the embers from our fire. I grabbed a bottle of water and was about to pour it over the coals when I heard those rustling sounds again. Except this time it sounded like footsteps, and it sounded like it was directly behind me. I froze, and I remember being unable to catch my breath. Slowly I turned, and there, standing just a few feet away, was what I could only describe instantly as recognizing the guy from the gas station. His face was barely visible in the dim light, but in that instant my mind knew that was him. I recognized the purple flannel from earlier, and I wanted to scream and run, but I was rooted to the spot. I was so scared that it felt like I had forgotten how to breathe. The guy just stood there, staring at me, not moving a muscle, which somehow made this entire interaction even worse. It felt like an eternity, but finally, I found my voice. "Get away from me!" I screamed, and the sound seemed to snap him out of whatever trance he was in. He took a step back, and then another, and before I knew it, this guy was sprinting off into the woods. I didn't wait to see where he went. I ran back to the tent. Jess and Katie were rolling around as they heard me scream. I started to shake them and yelled, "We need to go now," and I could feel my voice shaking. My friends didn't really question what was happening. I started saying about how the guy from earlier was outside the tent, and apparently that was enough to get my friends panicking and packing, and we packed up all in record time, not even bothering to fold the tent properly. We just stuffed everything into our bags and took off down the trail. I remember the trail back being so nerve-wracking because we could barely see anything. It was dark and our flashlights didn't do much to illuminate the path other than the trees that were directly in front of us, and every sound we heard made us erratic and just caused us to run faster. We got to the car, and it still wasn't even dawn yet. We didn't say much on the drive home, as all of us were just still too freaked out at the process of what had just happened. And in hindsight, we should have just called the police right then and there. But getting away was the only thing on our minds at that time. When we finally pulled into Jess's driveway, we just sat there for a moment, staring straight ahead. And that's when I finally called the police and reported what had happened. I told them about the guy from the gas station, and I told them about the approximate time that we had encountered him. I remember Katie begging me to get off the phone with the police because she was scared that she was going to get in trouble for the alcohol, but if this guy was some sort of creep, I wanted to make sure the cops knew. Now, it's been years now, and we never did figure out what that guy wanted, or if it even truly was him from that place following us. And after that night, we decided our summer adventures were over. I can still imagine the sight of him standing there in the dark, staring at me, and I often wonder what would have happened if I hadn't gone out to check the fire. Not that it's the most reassuring thought, but I also hope that this man was just a peeping creep, and not something way, way worse. This took place few months ago, when my girlfriend and I were feeling bored at home and wanted to do something different. So we decided to go for a hike on the spur of the moment. We don't go hiking often, but the idea sounded good to both of us. It was late in the afternoon and there was only about an hour of daylight left, but we thought it would be fun to explore a nearby trail before it got dark. We quickly filled up our water bottles, put on our best walking shoes, and headed out the door. Then we drove up into the mountains, which are known for having many hiking trails. The trails get more varied and interesting the higher you go. Now, usually we stuck to trails near the base of the mountains where there are lots of people, but this time we wanted something different. We decided to drive further up the mountain to a trail that a friend had told me about, but we kept an eye on the time and figured we could hike for a bit and enjoy the new area before it got too dark. When we arrived at the start of the trail, we saw there were no cars parked along the road, which was a bit unusual. However, we didn't think much of it since it was getting late and assumed most people had already left. We still had about 45 minutes of daylight, so we decided to keep going. We began by walking down a steep hill, then had to climb up another steep hill to get back to the same level. Then once we reached the top, the trail became much smoother and easier to walk. As we enjoyed the view, we spotted a lone coyote a little ways off the trail and saw some rabbits nearby. So I made a joke that the rabbits should be careful since the coyote was around. She gave me a playful nudge for that joke. Less than a mile into the trail, we came across a large fallen tree that formed a bridge over a dried-up riverbed. We decided to take a break, climb around on the tree, and take some pictures. After about 10 minutes, we got back to hiking. We hadn't gone far when she heard a rustling noise in the trees behind us. We stopped for a moment, feeling a bit nervous about the noise we heard, as it sounded like something large was moving in the trees. But we shrugged it off and continued walking for a short distance. But she soon decided she was done and wanted to head back. It was getting darker and the light was fading slowly, so I agreed with her. We turned around and started making our way back to the car, but when we got back to the fallen tree, I realized my shoe had come untied. So I used the trunk of the tree to help me tie my laces again. While I was doing that, I glanced behind us for the first time during the hike. And there I saw a man wearing all black with his hood up, walking slowly and steadily behind us. It didn't seem too unusual at first, as people wear black all the time, and it was cold out, so wearing a hood made sense. Then I reminded myself not to jump to conclusions just because of their outfit. I often wear black myself, and there was no reason to assume anything was wrong. So I told my girlfriend about the person I'd seen. It was now getting dark, and the trail was starting to feel a bit creepy. So we decided to walk faster and went through a winding part of the trail, where it was hard to see far ahead. Now during this stretch I lost sight of the person, and thought he was far behind us. However, as we rounded the final bend, I noticed the person was behind us again. And this time he was much closer than before, which made me feel uneasy. He was now only about 50 feet behind us, much closer than the 100 feet before. And since we had been walking faster, this made us really nervous. We quickly rounded another bend in the trail, and as soon as we saw the open path ahead, we started running. It was natural reaction for both of us. We didn't need to say a word, we just began sprinting as fast as we could, trying to get away from the person. We were almost back at the trailhead, just a few hills left to go. We stopped for a moment to catch our breath, and I glanced back again. I saw the person stop running when he noticed me looking, as if he was trying to act like he was just walking. We sprinted down the hill as fast as we could, with a little bit of light left struggling to get through the thick trees around us. Running down the steep hill was hard because we couldn't see the path clearly. We both stumbled and almost fell several times, hitting rocks and loose brush with our feet, but we managed to stay on our feet and didn't look back. We made it to the bottom of the hill, but we still had to climb up the initial hill to reach the car. We pushed through the incline and finally got back to our car. I took a quick, relieved breath as I started the engine, my heart racing and adrenaline still high. As I backed out onto the road, I saw the person come out at the trailhead, apparently out of breath. We finally got a good look at him. His hood had fallen off, revealing his pale face and lifeless eyes, which were only lit up by a single lantern at the trailhead. He was holding something in his hand, but it was too dark to see clearly, and I didn't want to stay and find out what it was. I put the car in drive and sped away as fast as I could. As we drove away, we kept checking the rearview mirror, but the person slowly disappeared into the darkness. Then we went straight to the police station and told them what happened. In response, they said they had been getting reports of similar incidents over the past few days. Then they told us they would contact us to identify the person if they found him, but we never got any feedback after that. College projects are supposed to be straightforward, right? You choose a topic, you do the research, put it all together, and maybe learn something along the way. When my friend Carlos and I signed up for a class, we thought it would be fun. A break from the usual grind. The assignment was simple: create a short documentary. But being the overachievers that we were, we decided to tackle something bigger, something that would set our project apart from the rest, and most importantly, something that was interesting to us. And that's how we ended up in the middle of this supposedly cursed forest, not far from where we live. Our goal was to debunk the local legends that had kept people out of those trees for decades. The forest was beautiful in its own way. It had tall, lush trees and a special kind of quiet that was almost therapeutic. But that silence had a weight to it. It was like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The stories about the forest go back generations, I've heard. Native American tribes used to live there, and the forest was supposedly sacred ground. You know, the same typical setup as every other cursed story in the United States. But then came the stories of ghosts, demons, and dark rituals. In my opinion, I believe it was just old folklore and myths that people said happened deep in those woods. and those myths got blown out of proportion and spread through the generations. Most people avoid the place, and those who didn't usually came back talking about negative energy and all that garbage. In case you can't tell yet, I'm not a paranormal or really energies or anything like that. And neither was Carlos. We didn't just buy that the woods were cursed. We thought it was all just superstitions and campfire stories. And that's why we thought that this was the perfect subject for a documentary. A chance to peel back the layers of folklore and show the world, or at least our class, that these woods were just another patch of trees. We spent the first few hours filming the scenery, capturing shots of the sunlight filtering through the trees, the dense foliage, and even some of the caves we found scattered throughout the area. It really was objectively a beautiful forest. There was one cave in particular that caught our attention. It wasn't deep, but the way the light played off the rocks made it perfect for the eerie vibe that we were going for in our film. As we set up the camera inside, it felt like something had changed. The sun started to shift behind the clouds, and it almost felt like the sounds of nature started to quiet down. Right at that moment, Carlos stopped, and freezing mid-shot, he whispered something in a very scared voice, asking if I heard that. I hadn't heard anything, but the look on his face was enough to make me feel somewhat uncomfortable. We stood there in the dim light of the cave, straining our ears. Then I heard it too, a sort of sound coming from outside. We had been hearing the wind blow all day, but this was definitely no wind. It was clearly the sound of someone or something approaching the cave. These footsteps would close in slowly, and then they just fade into the distance as if they were running away when they got close to the cave. We exchanged these very nervous glances at each other, and we spent the whole day laughing off the stories. But at that moment, I was not afraid to admit that I had felt a twinge of fear. My mind raced with a bunch of different scenarios. Maybe it was just another hiker or some animal passing by, but the longer we stood there, the more I started to doubt those rational explanations. Trying to keep a steady voice, I told him that we should wrap things up as we got enough footage. He didn't argue. We quickly packed up the camera and gear. We both tried to play it off as if though we were cool, but it was obvious we were both moving pretty frantically. As we stepped out of the cave, the forest seemed darker than it should have been, since the sun had started dipping in and out behind the clouds. The feeling of dread was overwhelming, and with every step we took back toward the car, the sense of dread grew. We hadn't gone far when the sound came again, this time louder and much closer. We stopped and tried to assess the sounds. We were listening as the rustling morphed into the unmistakable sound of footsteps. We turned, and that's when I saw them. Two dark figures moving swiftly through the trees, their shapes blurred by the shadows. And we both started to run. I turned back several times, and it was impossible to tell what was chasing us. I was refusing to believe that it was some dark entity, but I truly just couldn't tell in that moment as my heart was racing. Carlos and I were running awkwardly through the forest, trying not to run into trees or trip on the roots, and it seemed almost like these people were gliding through the trees. The faster we ran, the louder the footsteps grew, until it felt like they were right on top of us. I risked a final glance over my shoulder and got my clearest view of these people. Not only were they still chasing us, but they were closing in very fast. They were clearly human-shaped, but there was something just off about them, something in the way they moved. I couldn't make out any details other than that they were shaped like people. They clearly were dressed in all black, and they moved so effortlessly through the trees. Carlos could see that I was slowing down since I was looking back at these people, and he shouted for me to hurry up, and we made our final push to the car. We practically dove into the car, slamming the doors shut behind us, Carlos fumbling for his keys, his hands shaking, and when he finally turned that ignition on, the engine roared to life. Relief flooded through me until I looked down and saw the dashboard light up with some warning saying tire pressure low. Carlos looked confused but didn't think too much about it. He just threw the car into gear, but the moment we tried to move, the vehicle lurched awkwardly. Our tires were flat, all of them. I stuck my head out the window and saw that the tires looked as if they'd been slashed. And before we could fully process what was happening, Movement caught my eye. I looked up and there they were. It was 3 people, not just 2, emerging from the tree line walking slowly towards us. My stomach dropped as I realized that they were the same blurred shapes that I was seeing before. And these weren't some ghostly apparitions, but actual humans, dressed in solid black from head to toe, their faces hidden behind featureless masks. And these masks looked very similar to ski masks, maybe a shiesty if you're familiar with those, just complete black though. The car was locked, but that did little to calm the rising panic inside me as they drew closer. Carlos frantically tried to dial for help, but the signal was very weak and the call continued failing to connect. Finally, Carlos got through to someone. He was screaming for help, giving his location, and then we lost the call again as it dropped. I could see the figures now more clearly than ever. One of them had a more slender build and smaller hands that had glittering nail polish, a detail that should have been insignificant but somehow made the situation even more strange. I almost wished that it was some dark entity instead of a person. One of the people started to bang on the window while the other 2 started to kick the doors and bang on the hood. Their fists continued to slam against the doors, rattling the car with every shot. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to think and come up with some kind of plan, but the situation was paralyzing. One of them, the smaller one with that nail polish, started pounding harder on the window, the glass beginning to crack with the force. I could hear them laughing, which was just more of a reminder of how horrible this situation truly was. The glass felt like it was going to give. I knew it, and there was nothing we could do. But then, through all this chaos, we saw lights appear. Sirens in the rearview mirror were a welcoming sight for once in my lifetime. These masked figures froze. Their laughter stopped as they turned to look, and as the vehicle was approaching, I was able to make out that it was a park ranger. And without a word, these people bolted back into the woods, disappearing as quickly as they appeared. The ranger pulled up beside us, his face sort of a mixture of concern and confusion as he got out of the car and approached us. He asked if we were okay, and we nodded, still too rattled to speak. The ranger led us to his vehicle, his radio crackling into life as he called for backup, and we left the car behind, the relief of being away from those woods almost indescribable. Now back at that station, a bunch of cops showed up and we gave our statements, detailing everything that had happened. While we were still there, the police finally caught up with one of those people. It turned out to be a large dude with a goatee and a tattoo of a rose on each side of his temple, the stems curling down his cheek and down his neck. Perhaps the worst part of the story is when the officers asked him during questioning why he was doing what he was doing, and apparently he just smiled and said, "Because I could and I wanted to." His voice contained no remorse or empathy, and he seemed almost happy about it from what they were saying. We never found out who the other 2 weirdos were, never found out if they were part of some gang or just a bunch of sickos, and honestly I'm not sure I want to. The thought of them still out there just lurking in those woods waiting for their next victims is enough to keep me awake at night. After all of this, Carlos and I proved that the woods are not haunted, but that doesn't mean that monsters don't inhabit them.